Hello and welcome. I'm Martin Groschwald, CEO of Konzepthaus. What you're about to see and hear is one of 12 panel talks from our Mobility Design Conference 2025 at the Munich Motor Show, where we brought together leading voices from design, technology, and mobility to explore the future of our industry. In this session, you'll hear fresh perspectives and valuable insights straight from our stage. Let's dive in.
Thank you for being here. We are set to discuss the role of brand in the design department. And this essentially is a bit of a hen and egg situation, isn't it? What comes first, brand or design? What informs what in this instance? So lots of philosophical discussions and otherwise for the three of us and for the rest of you later on. But first of all, allow me to introduce the people sitting with me on this stage who thankfully know about brand and design, but are not people with a marketing background, but design specialists with a firm grasp of what a brand should stand for. Mr. Ben Payne, Vice President Design at Lotus, with a previous track record, I've been told, of having worked with Aston Martin, Bugatti and Makina, their design consultancy.
Correct, yeah.
Phew. And of course, Mr. Sam Livingstone, one of the leading design strategists of the industry, who has worked with and for an endless number of brands, if I may say so, and who also is a visiting professor of the Royal College of Art. Thank you, Sam.
Thanks, Christopher.
So, as I just said, we're dealing with this hen and egg situation. So does the hen beget the egg or the other way around? And does a brand form and inform design, or does the design inform the brand? That's really one of the core questions, is it not? So I'd like to ask the two of you, what exactly is this relationship like? If I may start with Sam.
I think hen and egg's quite a nice way of kicking it off, Christopher, because you could argue there is no single answer, as though I think we're almost sort of, if you like, done with a question and the answer to the question, because you define it as that. It's a symbiotic thing. One begets the other, as you said. So it's not that easy to have a simple answer. But I suppose you could argue that we would be naive within the design community to think that we are bigger than the hen. Fundamentally, the brand is the kickoff, and within an automotive context, design might see some level of leadership in terms of what's happening for the industry or the evolution of the product and so forth. But fundamentally, it's engineering is the core kickoff point. And I think historically, the brand has, if you like, been the leader. And sometimes design has been the tail that wags the dog, but predominantly its role is less great than brand, in my view. But that's just part of an answer, really. It's not a full thing. And I can witter on here forever, but I sort of feel like Ben's going to, I don't know, he's got to say something that's...
Well, yeah, I will, but I've got not a different point of view, but I think there's a way to kind of put this into some kind of metric, because to me, there's a kind of aspect of time, or probably a better way of expressing it would be maturation of the brand, which is important to consider in asking, which one comes first. So depending on the maturation of your brand, I think the relationship with design is different. So if you, for example, these days in the automotive world, there's an awful lot of new brands emerging, new things coming to the table. I think in that context, the design can have a bit more of an upfront influence on the direction of travel in the business. If you have an extremely mature, well understood, well developed, well known brand, then it flips to be the other way around.
Yeah, and I think that's a really nice way of articulating it. When you sort of think historically, the way in which many brands have become established over time before we even use the word like brand, and then design invariably has come along and, if you like, reasserted a fresh direction through design, which then has actually very much founded what that brand might stand for. I've just come straight from the exhibition centre, and BMW have put pretty centre stage the original newer Classe from, I think it's 61, 62, 63, and they're doing that quite conspicuously in the last few years, and I think it's very much them going, this is a key point for us as a modern brand, and I would suggest it's fairly well recognised that stood through design, very much founded what the brand means in modern times, or certainly meant up until quite recently. So I guess this whole relationship between the two it's almost the case of baton passing. Does brand lead or does design lead? And it can actually flux and flow and go around over time, as you say, Ben, depending on which one is of the most importance or which one needs to be the agent of change. One could perhaps argue that design is one of the most effective agents of change for what brand reputation is.
Yeah, I think so. And it's important to recognise that and make sure as designers we take the responsibility and deal with it correctly in terms of what we do to either reinvent a brand or to reinforce its values, which is something you see, I think, right now across the industry as becoming a kind of very poignant conversation.
You were referring to maturity, a mature brand, which of course could also be phrased differently by saying a legacy brand. And obviously Lotus has quite the legacy. Yet at the same time, of course, it's a brand that everyone has an opinion of, but in design terms certainly is not all that well defined at all. I mean, if you look at an Esprit, that's very much a Ital design rather than a Lotus design as such. If you look at the Elise, which was a very early, let's say, romantic design that was intentionally harking back to a previous era with its forms, Super 7 and whatnot. So not much in the way of consistency, yet a great legacy. How did you deal with that?
I think it's probably about 5 points in there that I can answer questions to. So let's start with the first bit around, let's say, maturity or maturation that I talked about. To me, that's not only linked to a legacy brand. So I think you can have a very mature brand that still doesn't have a vast history, like Lotus in this case, up to 77 years. I think there are some much fresher, newer brands that I still believe have an element of sort of maturation to them. So it's kind of 3 stages to it. You need first that kind of awareness. People know your brand. It needs to be visible. Then they need to understand kind of what you stand for and what it's about, the experience that you're presenting or offering to your customers. And then ultimately it's that kind of love of your product and the brand and people having that long-term kind of connection or desirability which they associate with what you do. So that doesn't have to be only in a legacy context. There are brands that have established themselves very quickly, I'd say possibly in less than 10 years here and there, to be at a point where they have that consistency and people know very well what they do and they are starting to generate that kind of desirability that lasts beyond one generation of product. Coming back to the point about Lotus and its inconsistency, let's say, I think if you look at the historical context of that, and you mentioned things like the Esprit, which is probably, or certainly in my opinion, the most iconic road car that the Lotus ever produced, it didn't really follow what came before it. And what came after it doesn't necessarily follow either. So to me, that's very much linked to the brand values and the brand story. So if you look at the ethos of Chapman and what he was actually doing, he was always moving on to the next thing. I mean, he's quoted many times in history of sort of saying he was completely disinterested by the past and he was only looking to what came next. And each new kind of thing he did in an innovation sense, or each new product that came out of the road car business, which was only really there to fund his true passion of racing, was very much looking to the future and not to the past. So it's a brand that now has that legacy of 77 years, but throughout its history, it wasn't evolutionary, it was far more revolutionary. And you see that across those lines of products. It was about a great technical solution to deliver a driver's car at that point in time, and not necessarily about just evolving slowly the product as some other legacy brands maybe have taken the approach to do.
So would your definition of a mature brand be that it's a brand that is being bought, or whose products are being bought by customers for what it stands for?
A little bit beyond that. I think maturation comes to the fact that, of course, your brand exists because it is appealing to customers. And a mature brand is one where it starts to go a bit beyond the kind of rational and the transactional sense of product purchase. It's more about the experience and then therefore what that brand ends up saying about you as an individual. So I think the maturation, as I said, it can come relatively quickly if people are super clear in what they're trying to achieve and, really standing for something. And I think, in a space where there are more and more brands, you could argue almost an oversaturation of brands in the marketplace, only if you look at automotive at this point. I think having a very strong position and having something that customers really engage with very deeply, it doesn't have to take 50, 70 years to get to that point.
I'm sure Sam would agree.
Well,
would you also like to elaborate?
Yeah, broad, and also I'm mindful that when we're talking about design in the context of brand, and so far at least anyway, and particularly pertaining to, I guess, that question to Ben about the sort of consistency at Lotus, I mean, the superficial read of the aesthetic of a Lotus from the generations that we've just talked about, the Spree and the Elise and so forth, they are obviously, without an awful lot of consistency, and I wouldn't argue with that. But then, within Ben's response, he's talking more, I think, about the values of Chapman, and originally, at least anyway. We haven't yet said lightweight, but I guess we're going to say it at some point.
I'd rather not.
And there's going to be a thing where, to some degree, you could argue that the aesthetic. I'm not really here on a mission to sort of substantiate Lotus's progression, because of course a lot of chaos was involved in it over the time. But you could argue that the red thread might be that they're all vehicles which look lightweight, and in a way which a Porsche or even a Ferrari do not or did not. So in other words, I'm not sure if actually the consistency of graphical or even surface and detail literally over time and their subtle evolution as symbols is the point. I think the point here is about the design expressing the semantically the meaning behind what that brand is. And yeah, I don't know. I don't think Lotus is a particularly brilliant case study in that, and I'm sure Ben wouldn't suppose it is either in terms of it having been inconsistent. But I think often when we talk about design communicating brand, we tend to come back down to how consistent it is in its representation through the literal surface, the form, the graphic, and so forth. And you could argue, for example, Neo do an amazing job of being consistent in what they have now. Their portfolio is consistent over time. They've been quite consistent, so they are therefore building a level of recognition. But that's not necessarily about them consistently representing the values of their organisation or their brand, if you like. So I don't think it's just a simple thing with regard to the idea of what what design does in terms of consistently expressing design.
I wholeheartedly agree, and my impression looking at this industry is that this understanding is increasing right now. That we're moving away just from cues and graphics towards not necessarily a more intellectual approach, but hopefully a more fundamental approach than just the family look, for example, which has been so predominant for the past more than 20 years.
Yeah, although, I mean, I'm sort of quite wedded to that idea too, but I feel like that's maybe because I'm in this bubble of car design, and it sort of, if you like, exemplifies the highest level of design delivery within the community that we have, or the industry, which is to say to be able to express the actual subtle and amazing meaning that many of these brands are that we engage with. I mean, are there more subtle and emotive and powerful meanings within brands that are outside of automotive? I don't see what those would be. They're certainly not in fast-moving consumer goods. I can't see how they're in tech goods. Car brands represent such an amazing embodiment of meaning to both brand side and customer side. It's incredible. So to be able to get that out and sort of evidence it through the form of a vehicle, through a Lotus concept, for example, this is the most amazing thing I think that we have within our space. I think it's such a fantastic thing. It turns me on. But to your point, that's becoming more and more important and recognised, I'm not so sure. I do wonder actually whether or not there is a logic to recognise also that design doesn't just fulfil a purpose of expressing the meaning of the brand, but it also stands as a symbol for telling people that they are of that brand. Now, on a simplistic level, you've got a logo that does that, the McDonald's M or whatever. Hey, I'm here, I'm at McDonald's or Volkswagen or whatever. But actually the different cues that you have on cars arguably seem to be increasingly falling by the by. And I'm not suggesting that we should all be wedded to them and they're of massive import, but in China, where you've got such a myriad of brands, and to some degree in most markets where the number of brands are on an uptick, and the vast majority of people are not part of the car design community, it's actually, I think, a missed opportunity for car brands not to be more clever about more simply signifying, hey, I'm here, I am of this brand, and to do so in a more clever, measured way, but on perhaps a more simple way. Not just to be focusing on the meaning, but on the symbolism and of the signifying of brand, because design is about signifying brand as well as expressing its meaning, and I think that's often overlooked.
Undoubtedly, I mean, right now we're being presented with more brands than ever, and yet their definition has quite often become so very blurry that even I myself, as I was wandering through Munich this morning, came across some recently established brands that I just couldn't identify, which leads us to maybe let's call them in vitro brands, and the opportunities and also challenges involved in creating these brands and establishing them. And allow me to name two examples which I find very interesting for different reasons. One of them is Polestar, because with regards to consistency and with regards to design quality, if you like, it doesn't get much better than that. At the same time, of course, the brand on certain levels isn't really working despite these qualities I just mentioned. On the other hand, you've got Cupra, which, in my personal opinion, is rather shallow and crass and isn't imbued with an awful lot of meaning. But at the same time, it's very, very successful. So what does that tell us about the relationship between brand and design and the market?
I'm in a slightly difficult position because, technically working for a brand, I shouldn't criticise others. My PR team would very much tell me that. So I'm not going to.
It was me criticising, not either one of you.
Exactly. But I think you need to look at it in a slightly different way. I'd wind it back slightly to this bigger conversation around brand. What is people's actual understanding of brand? Because a brand is, you're talking about logos and how things look and the visual consistency. This is effectively CI as branding and logos. How you show up and what it looks like visually is your visual identity, VI. But that's only a small percentage or proportion of what a brand actually is. So talking about those two particular examples, the brand is actually what your customers, the marketplace, the big wide world says about you. That's what your brand actually is. So you can do an amazing job of consistency in terms of branding, in terms of the visual identity and how you show up in products. But the real pull and the real power of brand comes from people really resonating with what you do and you standing for something which is very different in the marketplace. So when you talk about now this oversaturation, the amount of brands that are out there, to me personally, the real problem is that these brands don't have a very specific point of view. They don't have values which are vastly different from anyone else's, and that then gives them a problem in terms of how they resonate, particularly long into the future. So you may have a product category where you can be successful as a brand simply because of the value proposition. But this, again, is something at the end of the kind of immature brands where, it's just a transactional purchase. This is not going to give you brand value that exists long into the future, in my opinion, or indeed my experience, I would say.
Yeah, and I think that's we're sort of in a way covering off quite a lot of these different things and circling around in our conversation, but sort of Ben very much bringing in meaning, but going beyond that, talking about purpose, which is not something which is still yet much expressed, certainly not within automotive. Although the Polestar example, I think, is interesting in that context, which is that they're were unusually vocal about having purpose, and I think that actually meant something for quite a lot of their customers. Although it's debatable as to the extent to which that's evident in the through design. Design might be, as you described, something which is well liked, certainly within the design community, and instantly I suggest was commercially successful. The factors behind it not being were, I think, fairly clearly not connected to design in many ways. But the extent to which that necessarily connects to the purpose of that organisation or its sort of purported purpose, particularly with its ethics and low CO2, embedded CO2 and stuff, bit of a question mark. And I mean, I guess in a way, Ben's perhaps, and I don't know, I'm not here to interpret what you're saying, Ben, but are we talking also about authenticity, the degree to which design authentically communicates that brand or does not? Because it might be very consistent.
110%.
Yeah.
So that's not even down to design. Where brands really work for people, you will get a long-term desirability is built largely out of authenticity. You look at brands way beyond the automotive industry. You respect, love, and engage with brands that are authentic. And having a veneer of CIVI placed over the top of a hollow concept is just, it doesn't work in today's market. The consumer is way too smart. They have far too much information and have far too many choices. So, people are not going to engage with an unauthentic product. So I don't believe, it's going back to the crux of the conversation, that you can have brand exist over here and design over there. It simply doesn't work.
Yeah, it's just one thing almost. But I mean, I'm mindful in the consultancy that I'm with, the amount of times we're engaging with, should we say, a new brand or a relatively new sort of initiative at least.
Yep.
And they essentially want a sort of, can you build or can we have a new design identity? And this is what our brand is. And another point that you were raising, which is a rare incidentally, Ben, for a design director, is to talk about how the customer owns the brand. But typically we have a client base which is like, well, this is what we stand for. And you're like, you know what, that's kind of what everybody says. And then it's like, this is what we wish to design to communicate. And you're like, yeah, but how is that different necessarily to the others? And yeah.
I fully understand the point, and also I've been there. So most of my career was consultancy background. So I've done the kind of established OEM bit, legacy brands you mentioned. Those are way older than Lotus, both of the kind of more luxurious marques that I've worked for. But in consultancy terms, I have frequently been part of those conversations when you're starting a brand from zero. And in that point of view, I can tell you that design, in my experience and my belief, can actually lead the brand, because you have nothing at the start. So then it's very much about the product experience. When you're starting a new company, you're building a new brand, the experience is only the product. When you have a legacy of however many years behind you, there's much more information out there, there's much more for people to engage with than simply the product. You have amazingly powerful brands out there in the world where the customers are engaging with them without actually buying the product. Multiple examples of. And more as you go into the digital space, you can see that all over the place. They engage with a brand experience, which is not the product. It's not just about that transactional approach of I've paid money for that object. It goes way beyond. So in your consultancy world, I'm sure you are constantly faced with that. And I think there's still a great job for design to do. It's just a different one. As I said, to me, as the brand matures, the interaction or the interplay between design and brand will modify over time. So for a startup, it's, I think, very, very rational and sensible for design to lead the brand.
Yeah, and I wouldn't disagree with that, but I think one of the challenges there is to do that then in a way which might be consistent over time, because typically, you might give birth to something, it might be quite light for a few months, maybe even a year or two, and then it sort of just fades away.
Well, you need some stronger designers, don't you?
Yeah, or maybe stronger C-suite, potentially, to sort of, stay committed to that point. But yeah, maybe I'm talking too much politics of car company. But I think the other thing, though, is that invariably when we're in this situation of working with a client on that basis, we're saying, look, can we leverage something that you have which is truly distinct in your culture, in your, IP, in your sort of, national point of origin, to, if you like, ground this design direction in a truth which is actually somehow will be known or can be known, or that you can own.
That's authenticity again.
Yes, it is. Yes.
Yeah. So that makes perfect sense. But part of the reason why this long-term kind of build of a brand doesn't happen is actually born out of something I would put the criticism back on design departments, is people get bored too quickly. We live very much in the future of producing something that takes, even now, still at least 18 months for it to go from something to fruition in the marketplace. There's a problem with creatives getting bored of what they've built and wanting to move it on. And I think, fundamentally, people in senior creative positions need to understand that brand building takes time from zero, or if you're in a legacy brand and you're needing to move that to a different space or evolve it, it's a long-term process, way longer than a product cycle. So you need people not to get bored with what they're doing and to have enough substance in what they create that it will last over time.
But within that, I think there's a thing where, the classic cliche response for a designer or a design director when they're asked what their favourite design is, they say it's the next one, which is
I say that.
It's a good cliche response. But we are, if you like, being paid to pursue the novelty, to pursue the next thing, to pursue the new thing. So to some degree, I think designers at their core have to go beyond that whole sort of I'm now looking back to bring forwards. And I feel like one of the biggest challenges of design leadership is to be able to identify the elements that might be held on to, not in a sort of like, oh, we can't change this forever, we're wedded to the past, we have to be classic, we have to be retro, but to identify what elements can or should or must be preserved and or subtly evolved, and yet also what areas or realms might be truly distinctly new. And as a broad spectrum, I think mostly we see it cover all bases. They either make the radical step forwards or they make the conservative, retrospective evolution forwards. They don't necessarily look at it strategically to break up the chunks as to what might be preserved or not.
But that, again, for me, would link back to the brand values. So if you deeply understand the brand is strong enough in actually having that unique point of view or positioning, it should inform those decisions. So, based on what your brand represents, we can come back to Lotus if you like, this kind of idea of revolution over evolution, then we naturally as a brand, that history, that story and the values behind it tell you perhaps that, making a retrospective product would not be the right thing to do. Now in a different brand, your job is different, because you may find that in another OEM that they have a history of evolving a product very, very slowly, and you need to maintain that because it's part of what the brand always did, in my opinion.
And with the move towards electrification, what would your thinking be with regards to which elements to keep in order to keep the tradition intact?
You've got to maintain the experience. So again, the brand is beyond the aesthetic.
Okay.
there's a problem inside design again of people only talking about the visual references, the visual cues. What you're actually providing to the customer is an experience which should be different than that which they can buy from a competitor. So that unique proposition cannot only be a visual one. It's part of it, and it must remain part of it, but that's a kind of relatively thin subject in terms of the overall experience. So in a shift of technology, you're trying to have that technology relevant to providing the experience that the customer understands from your brand, not just throw it all in the bin and start again, because then you may as well be a startup brand.
I think there is a really interesting component though to your question there about how brands pivot to electrification and, if you like, still maintain some legitimacy or truth to the way their design expresses brand, which was founded at a point before that electric powertrain. And it seems quite apparent to me that some brands can inherently more easily do it because their brands are more aligned to an idea of a vehicle which is electric, which is digital. And I think, for example, a bit superficial, but BMW to an extent has those ingredients in the way that Jaguar does not. And there's something about the nature, that's my understanding of these brands, that one of them is more connected to the idea of a sort of contemporary technology, which is true all the way through time for it, whereas the other one is more classical, wind in the hair, driving up mountain passes and stuff. Again, I'm being a bit flippant perhaps, but essentially I think there's something about the nature of the brand and how that actually connects or does connect with what the idea of the car is and how the electrification is actually changing what the idea of a car is. In my mind, it's quite easy for Honda as a brand to be an electric thing in a way that Maserati as an electric thing just doesn't work. And I think there's a wrong footing there for these brands, which is, it's not like I actually feel sorry for a brand, but where I feel like they are going to be challenged in a way that some brands are not. But then latterly, you've got the way in which, an electric BMW or an electric Honda speaks of being a Honda, as well as speaking of this new idiom of what car is, that it wasn't, when it was still petrol powered. So I think it's sort of, if you like, it just layers it up. It relates to the point of brand and design, but it almost sort of just postulates the way in which brand actually needs to mean something different in a different realm of motivation.
At Konzepthaus, we believe knowledge should be shared. That's why we created House of Learning. With House of Learning, we offer tailored courses in both design craft and design leadership. Whether it's helping designers sharpen their skills or master new tools, or supporting leaders and guiding their teams with efficiency, innovation, and a culture where creativity can thrive, we're here to get your studio future ready. Visit konzepthaus-consulting.com to explore the broad range of our learning courses.
Can we maybe boil it down in a sense to interconnection between driving and transportation becoming looser, if you like? Because you've got, particularly with regards to China, you've got certain brands that are not about providing a car in the sense of Nürburgring and performance and fast driving, but transportation. At the same time, you've got the Western traditional brands which have always been, to some extent, been defined by driving. And of course, with the predominance of the German sector, you have this extraordinary focus on performance. And whereas these days, the performance that maybe matters more to more people is the comfort, is the space, is the digital amenities and whatnot.
I mean, I think you can do that, Christopher, and I think that's kind of what has happened, but I suggest there's still opportunity space, and, I feel like it's odd sitting next to Ben, because, of course, he's part of this brand, which is incredibly storied, if possibly outside of the car design community, barely known, and actually of all those storied brands that kind of, invert commas, works with being electric, there it is. It works in a way that Ferrari doesn't. Lotus is not centered to sort of, a 12-cylinder thing that makes a really fantastic sound. And actually, I still think we are in a stage of opportunity space for a very contemporary electric, digital, whatever it is, to be making an emotive, high ground claim. And I think we've variably seen attempts towards that. And I think, Ben's got concepts and designs which walk towards that too. But I still think at the minute, you could argue it's not actually being crystallized in the way that we do still understand that we can travel into the Messe with an electric-powered tube. We can, use electric to use our phones. We have got a very firm understanding of what electric means in the mundanity that sits around transportation, but we have yet to fully grasp how that might also work for an emotive, wow, amazing, cool, pinnacle experience. I mean, I think it will come, and it's really, an exciting task for people to work it out. And God knows, it doesn't look like it's that easy to do right now, but it's in the wings, presumably.
It's definitely not easy to do, and I probably personally spend a lot of time thinking about why and how to try and get that thing to land. But I'd bring it back to the customer. Again, design departments, creative people inside the industry itself has to be a little bit cognizant of the fact that we are developing future things. We see technology, we see the wow in it, we see all the benefits in it, but at the end of the day, we still run a commercial business. And if the customer's not ready for it, it won't work. So when you're talking about this really emotive way of dealing with the digital and the EV technology and all the things that we have at our fingertips today, I think there definitely is an answer. I think it will vary greatly from one brand to another what that looks like, and it should. Otherwise, your brand, again, in my point of view, has no meaning. But you've also got to look at the customer. So the fact we deal with in a brand like Lotus is, as you say, it's very well known by a very small and limited group of people. And that means we have this purist customer base that is somewhat reticent to change. And you tend to see that inside all legacy brands. There's a group of people that want it to remain as it was. But in order to create a more sustainable business, and I mean financially, actually engage with more customers and have more of an ability to actually exist long into the future, you need to stretch your customer base and grow it. And that means doing something different quite often, especially if your brand commercially operates in a very small niche. Niche brands struggle to stay alive these days. So you have to, on the one hand, balance what the purist expects you to do and stay true to your brand values, whilst also managing to attract new people to your brand and stretch your audience, grow your audience.
In that sense, to what extent would you say is brand, specifically Lotus's brand, a provider of guidelines for the future, and to what extent is it a straitjacket, and how do you balance the two?
It's absolutely both, I think. I mean, I don't really see it as a straitjacket personally with a legacy brand. I think that strength of you standing for something very specific, I think as we evolve the next five years is probably enough. You'll see a lot of brands fall by the wayside because they simply don't represent anything which is long-term valuable to people beyond, I've bought a device. Cars are becoming a little bit more like the tech goods, the electronic devices that we have. They're more disposable than ever. It's just consumed. You buy it, you use it, it's a tool and it's gone. But, the more desirable product will always represent something more than that. And to have that long-term kind of brand stickiness, people being attracted to you need to have a very specific point of view. So I don't see it as a straitjacket. I see it as a way that you can clearly make informed decisions, which should then help you exist long into the future because you're listening to your customer and you're staying true to your roots to a certain degree, whilst you must still evolve. I think where it might be seen as a straitjacket is if your brand is so in conflict, the traditional values with the direction of travel in the industry.
And since you addressed this yourself, the traditional Lotus buyer is not exactly the same kind of person you would sell one of your electric cars to.
You'd think that. It depends. It depends how pure they are on that scale of purism. So there are people that still engage with both. A niche, let's say, very focused sports car is not something that most people will drive every day. So we have seen, even though they kind of are somewhat quiet around it, a number of customers that own older, very, very tight and focused vehicles who maybe have reached a different stage in life, and they quite like to have a different form of transportation that still somehow makes them feel that connection back to brand. So predominantly it is brought by a new customer base, some of the new lifestyle products that we do. But there are customers that still engage with both ends of that spectrum.
And so in your line of business, when, obviously each case is standing for itself, but broadly speaking, is your job more about, let's say, pointing at what each brand is representing already and what should be nurtured, or is it more about exploring possibilities for growth and for expanding the brand?
Well, as a simple answer, it's both. But in a way, red threading back to what Ben has introduced, which is to say, again, rare for a design director, to say that the market or the customer sort of, if you like, owns the brand and their perception is true. So the nature of the work that we are often doing in broad brushstrokes is to go in and say, well, I know you think you know what your brand is and you think you know where you might be intending to take it to, but truly it's likely you do not actually know what your brand is, because actually that's not from within the organisation. That's not, it is not true that the organisation owns it, it's the customer. So typically we start out by actually doing a body of research which establishes how they are known in variable markets. And that is very rarely exactly what they thought they were. And the simplistic analogy that we'd hold up there is it's one thing to have an ambition to change your brand and make it kind of cooler, sexier, more innovative, all the normal cliches. But fundamentally, even if you've got a sense as to what your brand might be in the future, if you don't know where it is now, then are you heading north to that point or west or east? You literally do not know which your direction of travel is unless you know confidently where you are. And you don't know where you are unless you have got a clear understanding as to what your customer is. And of course, if you're an OEM brand, Ben can ask somebody who owns a Lotus what they think of it, but they won't tell him the truth because they know Ben is at Lotus. So there is a real imperative to do this sort of, if you like, homework. Going, no, truly, where are you? And within that, normally to hold up to the client, well, you know what? It's less good news than you thought. And by the way, many people don't know you / you're very dull or something to that effect. So there's normally a bit of an underwhelming output there. But within it, there's normally, to your point, something which is positive to leverage up. And invariably, that might be a secondary attribute, like, you are this brand, but you're known to be this brand from that country. So typically, if you think of a car brand, little sort of audience participation, think of a car brand in your mind. And typically, if you said that brand to, I don't know, a relation who knows little about cars, they would, and you said, what is this? They would say, it's a car brand. They would probably have those two things. That most car brands are known for making cars. But if you said, well, tell me something else, they would probably then say, oh, it's from Italy or France. So nation is normally the sort of next point. And there might be other things, but what they will never say is, oh, it's an innovative car brand. Whereas if I ask the client what they're known for, they're like, oh, we're known for being, it's just like, oh my God, give us some. So there is a whole thing there where actually being confident about what you are is important, but to your point, leveraging what your strengths are, but also addressing, if you like, your weaknesses, or at least going for the opportunity space, which might be there's white space, nobody's there. It might be like actually the whole world is going to be more interested in this, or it might be like, oh, all your customers are doing that. So do you know what I mean? There's a variety of different ways in which you might navigate that. But back to that nationality point, and not to sit on it too long, if you're a brand which is known as being a car brand that's from England, Lotus, for example, England, of course, means many things to many people. It doesn't necessarily directly connect to your sort of Lotus understanding. And then you've also got compound things, which is that if you're known as a car brand from a nation state, that actually has a secondary meaning. So the primary meaning, if you like, is that you're from the UK. So, red telephone boxes, Big Ben, I don't know, Empire, whatever your associations are, it's a sort of British thing here. But then there's also maybe a sort of wooden leather, Jaguar, Aston Martin, Rolls Royce, that sort of stuff. So there's both Britain, but then there's also British cars. And the same works for many other nation states. Say America, we've got all sorts of connotations of that. There's probably some fast food as we sort of think about it in our minds for America. But then say American car, and it's like, there's some fins in our minds, do you know what I mean? So you actually have all sorts of associative meanings which you are subconsciously there, which are actually within almost everybody's buying profile. So, what do you think about Toyota? Not much, yeah, but what do you really think about Toyota? Do you know where it's from? Well, yeah, I know it's from Japan. Well, what do you think of Japan? And suddenly you've got a whole load of ingredients which actually your market does know about who you are, or at least expect you to be. So there's an awful lot of ingredients within the brand that we look at, but then, and that's a very important starting point, that's where you are on the map. Then it's like, where do you want to go? And you're much more empowered to know where you want to go when you actually know what you are and maybe how much climbing you need to do or adjustment you need to do, or also the untenability of how far you want to go. Because we often also have that with clients. We're like, well, we've all heard the announcements from different brands. There was a recent one, I shouldn't be offensive, but one of the recent brands, we're going to be better than Bugatti or something. It's like, it's kind of a silly thing to say, isn't it? You can't go box fresh and be bigger or better than Bugatti. Anyway.
Well, it might take 110 years and an awful lot of money.
Yeah. So anyway, yeah, I don't know. I've answered your question by saying both of those things, Christopher. I hope that's a good enough answer.
Obviously, the point you're raising is one of my personal favourite subjects, of course, the automobile as a cultural object. And it's interesting that right now, at this point in time, when we're at the start of the bust following the boom, inevitably, we'll be seeing which brands make it and which ones don't. And my personal argument would be that it's the ones that possess a particular culture I mean, you were referring to
strength, brand strength
yes.
again.
Yes.
So to survive, you need to have a point of view that people is visible to people, and they very much understand it. And I think there's a plethora of brands out there that you could ask many people in the marketplace for a new car. If we're going to talk, strictly on automotive, what does that brand stand for? What does it mean? And I don't mean what's the badge on the front or where it comes from. What is that all about? And if you can't answer that question, those brands will struggle to survive long into the future, in my opinion. So, what you're talking about, going into clients and them trying to tell you where they want to go but not understanding where they are is a critical problem. The building blocks have to be formed from, it's not just a legacy thing, it's the current understanding of what you are. That's not necessarily what you were 100 years ago.
So maybe a bit of let's say, crisis-induced humility might help.
I believe so.
In the long run?
I think so, yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I think, you've all got to look at it. The industry is undoubtedly, as you say, I like that, bust following the boom. So we are headed into that stage, aren't we? Definitely. In my opinion, around us, there's a lot of people starting to really panic about what the future holds in the automotive industry. And you can talk about the socio-economic climate. You can also talk about the transitions to new technology. But there's a lot of other reasons, which is, maybe we have product lines or brands which are very shallow. And, what is the validity of them existing long into the future? So I think there is a time for people to think a little bit more deeply about what they're doing. And I would say that a lot of responsibility needs to sit with brand and design and brand to make sure that you're actually reflecting what people believe you are, not just blindly saying I'm following a new tech direction because everyone's going there. If it's not relevant to your customer or relevant to your brand, then you probably shouldn't be doing it.
Yeah, and I think this sort of the way in which potentially in some respects design is following the smoke and mirrors of a more immediate communications message, which in itself may not be founded, but that's not the topic of this conversation, I think. But the way in which we're seeing that evidence seems to be quite, not universal, but quite a lot of that. And there is a sort of commodification of design, I think, which is happening. I mean, not to slam it and say that, car design now is at a weak point, because I don't really truly believe that's the case. But it does seem to be much more quickly reactive and concerned and needing to be conservative with a small c in many respects. There's an awful lot more evidence of people looking to the left, looking to the right, looking just behind them, then making their small step forwards. There's less big step forwards with less concern for what's to either side. And that's not necessarily better, but it's certainly in terms of creative delivery and moving the world of automotive design forwards and finding a distinct position and one that might actually sort of represent a brand with a particular purpose and meaning is diminished. So therefore the playing field is an awful lot more, well, do you want that one or that one or that one or that one? There's less reasons to navigate. And back to this whole point about the customer owning brand, well, yeah, the customer owns what they're going to buy. And when all the brands actually have less discernible points of differentiation, we're in Munich now. It's interesting to be up to the BMW stand. I was really looking forward to seeing the iX3. It was less than I thought it might have been. I was interested to be, to seeing the new Mercedes GLC electric. You go and see that, and again, it's just less than it might easily have been. And then, I have yet to see the Audi, and because that's a very different story. But there is a thing where I sort of look at what we've got as these three big brands in this nation state, and how the reasons why you may choose one over the other are far less clear than they were 20 years ago. And that seems to me not self-serving. They are sort of commodifying their position. They will arguably, therefore, surely not be able to charge the premium they might otherwise have been able to do. They will not have that relationship, that depth, the people that invest in. It just seems to be an unnecessary thing, but possibly born also of trying to have a model line that appeals to as many as possible. A lot of design, although it's not spoken out loud, is less about trying to appeal to people strongly. It's trying to not appeal to as many people as possible. And I know that is a function which has value and arguably might drive total sales for certainly a mass brand. And of course, many premium brands can move to mass and have done successfully off the back of that. But it does arguably leave them in a more vulnerable position. Maybe Porsche's a little example of that. So I don't know. I think the transition might, I guess we hope as creatives that it might lead to a point where there are slightly more distinct shapes of both design and brand as offers that are in the marketplace.
I think it moves in cycles. I mean, I agree with what you're saying about people broadening their model lineup, and you're trying to remove the reason for people not to buy it effectively, aren't you? That's this kind of vanilla effect where everything has the same taste, and actually it's not a very strong position at all. But I think it's, to me, cyclical. I think we've gone through that. and it's going to stop working. It probably already doesn't work in terms of why should people part with the cash for that, or just go and buy a product that does a very similar thing for half the money, because that's now on offer. So particularly as you go into premium, more luxury space, people are questioning the kind of tangible value of something, aren't they? The value proposition. You say your brand is XYZ and it's better than everybody else's, but the product over here with a less, how should we say, powerful, potentially brand associated with it, is giving me exactly the same experience for half the money. And that's probably what's driving, in my opinion, the shift that now needs to happen within the premium, the established and the luxury sector to differentiate properly and stand for something. Because the customers they've got too many choices. And you don't have a strong enough position to prize the money out of their wallet, frankly.
Isn't strong design not just about knowing what you are and what you stand for, but also specifically knowing what you are not and what you don't stand for?
Absolutely. I mean, we use that quite often inside, I would call it the creative team at Lotus as a separate subject. We don't run a design department. It's all very blended together. But quite often when people are struggling to do something, we will simply put a page of, these are the no's. We're not any of that. And that's often, even for people inside the creative team, something much easier to digest than all the things that you want to be. It's given the things they definitely should not, as a set of guide rails for why you go somewhere or you don't.
I'm mindful, though, that we are potentially three people that look and perhaps in a way are quite similar. And this conversation we're having, I almost hear a slight nag in my mind that the world is moving on fast and that we're sort of potentially getting ourselves, agreeing with ourselves a lot about a trajectory or an idea, which also sounds a bit like how things used to be done. And I am wedded to it, I do believe it, but just as a sort of bit of a provocation, is this really the case? Because if it were the case, how come what we're espousing of being more distinct and clear about purpose, dialing up this sort of distinction, how come that's not, catching fire right now? Because it's not catching fire.
Fear. And the fact that right now people are still selling plenty of product. So, even when we're talking about the impact of, sales dropping in China and certain brands losing X amount of money, they're still making an awful lot of money and a lot more than they were 20 years ago. So they're still on a relative scale, a level of success inside some of these companies. And I think they need to get to the point where there's more of a financial problem potentially before they will actually take the plunge and reinvent themselves. And I think you see it happening. I think there are brands now out there, established ones, who are starting to find new directions and push for something stronger, probably because they're in the position in that cycle where, frankly, they don't have the luxury of not doing it anymore.
Yeah, I am being provocative. I am wedded to it myself. And you see it in other industry sectors where it's much more, if you like, provable, because there are brands with purpose where they can connect that to greater return on investment and so forth. But there's also this nag I have in my mind where you see how, particularly in the Chinese marketplace, where there's such a different set of sensibilities about being distinct is not the same thing in terms of how far distinction you might be, and also, if you like, in a way, the maturity of the marketplace and what they want, but also their relationships with brand. It's such a different thing. And if you like, the sort of playbook that we're sort of the playbook that we're talking about, Ben, in a fairly sort of, simplistic manner, I suppose. And of course, it does lean to you a bit with Lotus as a brand, which is, a fairly pinnacle premium brand. But in a more mass market sector, whilst I think it has validity, what we're sort of talking about, I do question whether it's sort of, so simple, just like those guys on the stage are saying. You know what I mean?
No, it's definitely not simple. It's hugely complicated. And I think the market does drive a different outcome. So a lot of the concepts we're talking about are probably established concepts of brand strength, which are more linked to European market for sure, the US market, potentially Japan, in terms of that kind of luxury brand appeal, how to build those brands. The sensitivity to that is definitely different, I would say, in the East. But there's a point of convergence, surely, at some point in time, where the China market, which in my opinion and experience is still driven more about the sort of tangible value proposition than the intangible.
Yeah, what it does, not what it is.
Yeah.
And that sort of thing, if is there not a space for a brand which actually is, inverted commas, all over the place in terms of aesthetic consistency or whatever it might be that's superficially read, but which is consistently delivering some sets of ingredients, which is, I don't know what they necessarily would be, but which is able to create a culture of design where they're actually able to lead in
I think
what
so.
they do.
But that's experience, and that's, automotive companies starting to talk more about experience than just the product experience. So how do you engage with very youthful potential customers through your digital channels and, social media and all of the conventional things we all understand today? That is not transacting and buying the product, is it? But you've still got brand engagement and you're still trying to pull people into it. So I think there is a space where, you can have a brand that operates in a very different way in different spaces that is not bound only out of the evolved visual consistency and a design language. It's an element of it, and I think the automotive industry and automotive designers, creatives, let's say, inside automotive, need to really very much stop focusing on only the visual aspect of what they do.
Yeah, and I think I would stand by that too. And it's hard for us to maybe sort of sit here and talk so fluently about the way a brand behaves through design when we're talking about the UX and so on. It's harder to sort of pull that smoke from the sky and actually sort of literally talk about it. But it does feel like that's such a trajectory that actually having brand communicating and sort of defining what it is and being built by the experience is where it's going. And that does also seem to be something which sits much more towards the Chinese marketplace. It is just harder to sort of put your finger on the examples of and the way in which you can make it more tangible with regards to sort of explaining what that concept is beyond what we've been doing now with the sort of more literal form-based design,
Well, it's an evolving equation, isn't it? We are yet to find the right recipe to how to do these things. But I think the thing that's very clear for me is the conventional approach, which is born out of conventional structures and how we used to do it, is, I would say, irrelevant. Not going to be. To me, it already was a couple of years ago. So things need to change. We need to shift the structures, we need to change the processes, because you're not trying to find the same result. You still need to leverage things from the past, legacy and storytelling, if you have it, is very, very important. But we can't keep showing up to, the same place of work, following the same structure, the same way of doing things with the same group of people and expect to, invent what you're saying, which is a very different thing which is needed for the future. So that's a fundamental part of the change which I think needs to shift. And there's always a fear in doing that, isn't there?
Interestingly, what you've just been discussing reminds me of an aspect of automotive history, because the former technical director of Jaguar told me that until the early 90s, what we call premium brands today, so Jaguar, Mercedes, BMW, they essentially had a gentleman's agreement that they would leave each other's, let's say, fields of exceptional know-how just to them. So Jaguar was NVH, Mercedes was safety and quality, BMW was driver engagement. So they wouldn't really want to consciously compete in those fields because they were the competitors' fields, and instead they were nurturing their own strengths. Might something along those lines, not necessarily in the form of an agreement, but again a focus on individual strengths, might this be part of the recipe for brand development and design in the future?
Yeah, I feel like that's a red thread behind an awful lot what we're talking about with regard to being true and having purpose. Which and Ben's list of knots that he's got internally. It's like being defining what you are, which is not all things to all men or all people, is sort of feels like a central tenet to a lot of what we've been talking about. That feels like a design, a trajectory that might make sense. Just as also in a way we've been articulating the way in which, to some degree, some of the issues that are actually manifest now is because brands are choosing to be, to cover all the bases, to be a Mercedes which drives brilliantly, to be a BMW which is safe as houses and so on. So I do think there is a thing there. But again, I don't know that it's just a return to the old way.
I'm not sure it is. I think it needs to be a focus, which I'll say is a bit of a return to the old way, but it needs to be a focus done in a different way.
Yeah.
So a less of people doing every single thing, all things to all people. That's not what brand strength is about. Yeah.
Maybe undoubtedly the parameters have changed, but maybe just the as I said, the understanding of what you're not might need to be rediscovered to some extent. And I think that would be a good moment to ask you in the audience if there are any questions.
Thanks for watching this session from the Mobility Design Conference 2025 as part of the Munich Motor Show 2025. I hope you found some inspiration and new ideas about where mobility design is heading in the future. If you'd like to see more talks from the conference, make sure to subscribe to the channel and stay tuned. There is more to come.